The morning sun pressed down on the small Colorado town like a memory that wouldn't fade. It was one of those rare fall mornings. Sky sharp as glass, air thin but forgiving, the kind of morning where everything feels slower, older, more exposed. Colonel John Jack Wallace sat on his 1970 Harley-Davidson shovelhead at the red light by Miller's Gas and Goods. His gloved hands rested steady on the handlebars, a stillness learned not from age but from years of muscle memory and restraint. The engine hummed beneath him like an old war song. Deep and rhythmic. He wasn't in a rush. He never was anymore. Then came the flash of blue and red in his rearview mirror, bright, accusing, interruptive. The kind of lights that had once meant backup was coming. Now they just meant trouble. Jack didn't flinch. He'd seen lights like that before. In different countries. Under different circumstances. Sometimes they brought help. Sometimes they didn't. The police cruiser pulled up fast and angled close behind his bike. Too close. 2 officers stepped out. The younger one moved like she had something to prove. Mirrored sunglasses, tan uniform still crisp, posture tight with authority not yet tested. Her name tag read Rhodes. "Is this some kind of joke?" she asked. Her voice dipped in irony. As she walked toward the old man on the bike, Jack said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the horizon. The sun had just kissed the ridge of the mountains, and the world was golden for a few precious seconds. In that light, he wasn't just an old man on a bike. He was a keeper of stories no one bothered to ask about. "Sir," Rhodes said louder. Stepping to his left side, her hand rested near her holstered sidearm. "I need you to turn off that machine. License and registration. And step off the bike." Jack blinked. Once. The way a man blinks when he's deciding whether the moment is worth the fight. From the passenger side of the cruiser, the second officer emerged. Older, slightly more relaxed. Officer Jake Monroe, broad shoulders, a grin that tried to be neutral but leaned skeptical. He walked with a slower pace, almost reluctant. Eyes scanning the crowd that was starting to gather on the sidewalk near the gas station. "Man," Monroe said under his breath, squinting at the Harley. "This thing's older than my dad." Jack slowly reached into the breast pocket of his flannel jacket and pulled out a worn brown leather wallet. No sudden moves, no resistance. He handed over his documents without ceremony. Rhodes took them, glanced at the license. 82, she said aloud, more to the air than to him. "Don't you think you're a little too old to be riding something like this?" No reply. Jack's hands dropped behind his back, interlaced with ease. His stance remained tall, centered, the posture of a man who had stood at attention in places where standing meant survival. "Hands on the bike, sir," she said. Feet apart. There was no probable cause. Nothing unlawful. Just a perceived imbalance of power and age, and the itch to act. Still, Jack complied. Because sometimes dignity means choosing your battles, and this wasn't his. From the storefront, murmurs began. A woman in a denim jacket whispered, "He's just standing there. Looks confused." Another man said, "Why are they bothering him?" And then the divide emerged, as it always did, one half assuming he needed help, the other assuming he was a problem. "Mr. Wallace?" Rhodes said louder. "Do you have family nearby? Anyone taking care of you?" Jack didn't answer. In his silence lived the weight of men who had taken care of themselves and others for longer than she'd been breathing. She took a step closer. "Sir, I'm talking to you. I'm listening," he said finally. His voice was low, solid, like dry earth cracking under a boot. "Then answer me. Don't you think it's irresponsible to ride a bike like this at your age?" That was when Monroe leaned in, barely audible. Might be a little deaf too. Look at him, just staring. Rhodes raised her voice. "Mr. Wallace, do you understand what I'm saying? Can you hear me?" He didn't look at her. Didn't look at anyone. He looked past them all. Through the brick buildings. Through the horizon. Through time. In that moment, he wasn't on Main Street. He was in a jungle somewhere, or on a desert road, or in a briefing room surrounded by younger men who thought they knew everything until they didn't. He inhaled slowly. Exhaled even slower. Silence was not his weakness. It was his shield. It was the armor he'd worn through 3 wars and 40 years of peace that felt harder than combat. Officer Rhodes looked increasingly unsettled. Monroe crossed his arms, watching the crowd grow thicker, phones rising into the air. Then, finally, Jack spoke again. "I've been taking care of myself for 82 years. It wasn't defiance. It was truth. The kind that cuts through assumption like a blade through silk. 10 miles outside of town, where the pavement turned to gravel and the mailboxes leaned slightly from years of wind, sat a modest farmhouse wrapped in white paint and silence. It wasn't much. Just an old barn, 2 cows, a fading American flag on a crooked pole, and a porch swing that creaked with memory more than weight. But it was home. Always had been. Jack Wallace had lived there for over 40 years. Alone. Not by choice, but by circumstance, the kind that comes when you outlive the people who knew your stories. Every morning, before the sun climbed up the eastern slope, he was already awake. Boots laced, kettle whistling, barn door open. He didn't do it out of necessity anymore. He did it because the rhythm of discipline had long ago become indistinguishable from the rhythm of living. Purpose, he'd learned, wasn't something you retired from. Inside his garage, the air smelled like oil and iron and old victories. Tools hung where they had hung since the Carter administration. There was no radio, no music, just the natural hymn of wrenches turning, chains clinking, rubber scraping against gravel. The 1978 John Deere tractor sat under a tarp, its hydraulic system blown out the day before. Jack already knew the problem. He didn't need a mechanic. He was the mechanic. He didn't guess. He listened to the way metal protested, to the slight hesitation in the machine's breath. 42 years of fixing engines had taught him the secret language of gears. In the far corner of the garage, parked like an old soldier on standby, was his Harley. It wasn't pretty. The chrome was dulled by time. The black paint had surrendered to rust in places. The seat had been patched twice with leather from an old army duffel bag. But the engine? The engine was thunder in a cage. When it roared, it sounded like it had something to say, stories of highways crossed, bases reached, and promises kept. That bike had carried him across states, across base camps, and across memories he didn't care to revisit. It was the last thing he owned that still moved like it meant something. No one in town knew any of this. To them, he was the old guy who filled up at Marcus's gas station every Thursday. Never late, always quiet. The man in the flannel jacket who bought the same groceries, eggs, bacon, black coffee, oatmeal. The man who fixed his own fence when it fell in the storm. Who shoveled his own driveway even when the snow came past his knees. They didn't know he had taught close-quarters defense to U.S. Rangers. Didn't know he'd served 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in the Gulf, and had flown into Afghanistan under a black call sign not even Google could trace. Didn't know he'd stood over the beds of dying soldiers and whispered words they asked him to carry home. Jack had a wall inside his house. No one saw it. One part was covered in medals, some official. Some earned in places no one officially acknowledged. Another part was bare. Just paint and holes where photos had once been. He didn't keep pictures anymore. Too many faces looking back. Too many questions he couldn't answer, like why did I survive? Or what was I supposed to do with all that silence after the war ended? People think grief is loud, but the worst kind. The worst kind sits beside you in the kitchen while you sip your coffee in the dark, saying nothing, just existing, like a shadow that learned to breathe. Jack never asked for anything. Not thanks. Not recognition. Not even company. But he had hoped in some small, human part of him that he could live out his days with quiet dignity. Ride to town. Fix his machines. Watch the sun rise without being seen as a burden, a problem, a hazard. They saw the rust, not the strength. They saw the age, not the endurance. They saw the silence, not the weight behind it. That morning, when the lights flashed behind him at the red light, he already knew what would happen. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. Different context, same script. People afraid of what they don't understand. Young officers assuming uniform equals superiority. Assuming an old man on an old bike was just another wandering relic. Maybe confused. Maybe dangerous. Maybe in need of containment. But Jack Wallace didn't fight back. Because after everything, after the war, the funerals, the decades of helping young men grow into warriors, he knew the one fight you don't win is the one where the other side refuses to listen. And yet he still showed up. Still rode that bike. Still stood tall. Not because he needed to prove anything, but because someone someday might look at him and wonder instead of judge. Might ask, who is he? Instead of assuming. What's wrong with him? The sun had climbed higher now, casting long, sharp shadows across Main Street. The moment felt too bright, like a spotlight on something that shouldn't be a show. Jack Wallace still hadn't moved. He stood beside his Harley with his hands clasped behind his back, boots firm on the pavement like he was back on a parade ground. His posture wasn't confrontational. It was composed, still, unshaken. Officer Emily Rhodes, however, was beginning to unravel. She joined the force to protect people like her grandmother, elderly, vulnerable, forgotten. But somewhere along the way, protection had become control, and understanding had become assumption. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her voice rising slightly as she said, "Mr. Wallace, for your safety and the safety of others, I'm asking you to get in the vehicle. We're going to take you in for a medical evaluation." A few heads in the crowd turned sharply. Murmurs followed. People began recording more deliberately now. Phones tilted upward. Comments whispered like prayers. Jack's eyes finally met hers. "I'm not going," he said quietly. Rhodes blinked. She hadn't expected that. "This isn't a request," she said. "Then what law justifies it?" Her mouth opened but nothing came out. For a split second, the badge didn't feel like armor. It felt like weight. Officer Jake Monroe cleared his throat, stepped closer. "Look, sir, no one's trying to cause a problem here. But a man your age on a bike like that." Jack cut in, not with volume, but with clarity. 65 years I've been riding. Never caused an accident. Never had a ticket. My reflexes were tested 6 months ago. Passed with higher than average scores. I can shoot a nail off a fence post at 50 yards. Can you? Monroe raised his hands, half in surrender, half in discomfort. "We're just doing our jobs, sir." "No," Jack said. "You're doing what you've been taught to do when you don't understand something. You escalate." The silence that followed didn't belong to any one person. It settled over the scene like dust. Officer Rhodes clenched her jaw, then spoke into her shoulder mic. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3. I have a possible 10 to 96. Elderly male. Uncooperative. Requesting backup for transport." Jack turned his head slightly, lips curling into something just short of a smile. 10 to 96, mental patient. A code she used not because it was appropriate, but because it was convenient. Across the street, the gas station owner Marcus Bell stepped out from behind the pump, wiping his hands on a rag already streaked with grease. His Gulf War veteran cap cast a shadow over his eyes, but they were narrowed and focused. He'd seen this very man, walk into his station every week for the last 15 years. Same routine, same courtesy, same quiet strength. This wasn't a confused old man. This was a man who never asked for anything, who paid in cash, who once fixed a stranger's broken fuel line in the snow without being asked. Marcus felt something in his chest. Tight, urgent, protective. He reached for the phone. Back on the street, Jack's tone hadn't changed. Calm, even, but now unmistakably sharp. "Young lady, I've trained men to stay calm under fire. I've watched 19-year-olds freeze in combat and learned the cost of hesitation. I've bled so this country can be free, including free to age. I don't need your evaluation. I need you to rethink how you see people." Rhodes stepped back slightly as if his words had a physical presence. "You're obstructing an officer," she said. "No," he replied. "I'm reminding you of the oath you took." Monroe looked visibly shaken now, unsure which way to lean. He scanned the crowd. A young woman was live streaming. An older man stood with his arms crossed. There was no clear right, left to claim. "Emily," Monroe said quietly, but she'd already gone too far. Backing down now meant losing face. And in the world of law enforcement, admitting you misread the situation wasn't easy, especially not on camera. "You need to get in the car, sir," she repeated, louder this time, trying to reclaim control. "I'm asking one last time." Jack's response was simple. "No." Marcus was already on the phone with Fort Carson. "Yeah, this is Marcus Bell. I got a situation here." "You know Colonel Wallace?" "Yeah. He's being detained by local PD, no cause, no respect. Just thought someone over there should know." The voice on the other end shifted instantly. "Did you say Colonel John Wallace?" "Sir, do not let them take him anywhere. Stay on the line. We're sending a team." Back on Main Street, Rhodes reached for her cuffs. And across the road. Marcus stepped closer to the edge of the curb, his voice trembling as he said to no one in particular, You don't put your hands on that man. The crowd held its breath. Something had shifted. Not in volume, not in action, but in energy. Jack Wallace hadn't moved, but he didn't need to. Marcus Bell's hands shook as he held the phone to his ear. Behind him, the gas station's fluorescent lights hummed like a prayer he couldn't quite remember. The voice on the other end was crisp, military, urgent. Mr. Bell, this is Sergeant Major Rodriguez at Fort Carson. You said Colonel Wallace is being detained. Yes, sir, Marcus whispered, his eyes never leaving the scene across the street. 2 officers. They're trying to force him into a squad car. No reason I can see. Just age, I guess. There was a pause. Then, sir, Colonel Wallace is a Medal of Honor recipient. 3 Purple Hearts. He trained half the Rangers currently deployed overseas. We're mobilizing now. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd known Jack was military, the bearing, the discipline, the way he carried himself. But this was bigger than he'd imagined. How long? Marcus asked. 15 minutes. Maybe 10 if traffic cooperates. Mr. Bell, I need you to document everything. And if they try to move him, you call me immediately. The line went quiet, but Marcus didn't hang up. He held the phone like a lifeline, watching as Officer Rhodes approached Jack with handcuffs gleaming in the morning sun. Across the street, the crowd had grown. Word was spreading the way it does in small towns, through whispers, through text messages. Through the kind of intuition that tells you something important is happening. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head. That man's been coming to town for 20 years. Never caused a lick of trouble. A teenager with a skateboard under his arm was live streaming, his voice carrying over the murmur. This is crazy, guys. They're literally arresting an old man for riding a motorcycle. But Jack Wallace remained still, even as Rhodes approached with the cuffs. Even as Monroe positioned himself to block any potential escape route, Jack's composure never wavered. He'd been in worse situations. Much worse. Sir, Rhodes said. Her voice tight with authority, she was trying to convince herself she possessed. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Jack looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. His eyes weren't angry. They weren't afraid. They were sad. The kind of sadness that comes from watching people make mistakes they don't have to make. Officer Rhodes, he said quietly, in about 10 minutes you're going to wish you'd handled this differently. She paused, cuffs halfway raised. Is that a threat? No, Jack replied. It's experience. The sound of engines in the distance was faint at first. A low rumble that could have been traffic, could have been construction, could have been anything. But Marcus Bell knew better. He'd heard that sound before, the synchronized roar of military vehicles moving with purpose. Jack heard it too. His lips curved into the slightest smile. Officer Rhodes, he said, his voice carrying a new weight. I'm going to give you one last chance to walk away from this with your dignity intact. She laughed. A sharp, nervous sound. You're in no position to be making offers, sir. The rumble grew louder. Monroe looked around, suddenly uneasy. Emily, maybe we should. No, she cut him off. We're doing this by the book. Jack nodded slowly. The book? Yes. Let's talk about the book. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, deliberately, the way a man moves when he knows every eye is on him. Rhodes tensed, hand moving toward her weapon. But Jack only pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. Not the one he'd shown them before. This one was different. Older. More weathered. He opened it and held it out. Rhodes looked down and went very, very still. It was a military ID. But not just any military ID. This one had clearance levels she'd only heard about in movies. Classifications that made her realize she wasn't dealing with a confused old man on a motorcycle. She was dealing with someone who had spent decades in places that didn't officially exist, doing things that were never officially recorded. Colonel John Wallace, Jack said quietly, United States Army Special Operations Command. Retired. The rumble of engines was getting closer now. Much closer. Monroe stepped back, his face pale. Emily. But Rhodes was frozen, staring at the ID, her mind trying to process what she was seeing. The clearance levels. The commendations. the photograph of a younger man who looked exactly like the one standing in front of her, but wearing a uniform that spoke of battles fought in shadows. "You want to arrest me?" Jack asked. His voice still calm, still controlled. "Go ahead, but you might want to call your chief first. And maybe the mayor. And definitely the FBI. Because that's who handles cases involving personnel with my clearance level." The crowd had gone silent. Even the teenager had stopped live streaming, his phone hanging loose in his hand. Marcus Bell was grinning now, still holding the phone to his ear. "Sergeant Major?" "Yeah, he just showed them his real ID. You might want to hurry." The voice on the other end was sharp. "We're 2 minutes out. This is about to get very interesting." And in the distance, growing louder by the second, came the sound of Justice wearing combat boots. The first Humvee rounded the corner of Main Street like a force of nature. Olive drab, imposing, moving with the kind of precision that made everything else on the road seem like toys. Behind it came another, then another. The rumble of diesel engines filled the air, drowning out the murmur of the crowd, the hum of the gas station's fluorescent lights, even the sound of Officer Rhodes' rapid breathing. Jack Wallace didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He knew that sound the way other men knew their children's voices. It was the sound of brothers coming home. The lead Humvee pulled to a stop directly across from where Jack stood. The engine shut off, and in the sudden quiet, the only sound was the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through the American flag hanging outside Marcus's gas station. The driver's door opened. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been carved from granite and discipline. Sergeant Major Carlos Rodriguez. 6'4", shoulders that could carry the weight of the world, and eyes that had seen enough combat to know the difference between a threat and a misunderstanding. He wore full dress uniform. Every ribbon, every medal, every insignia polished to perfection. This wasn't a casual visit. This was a statement. Behind him, more soldiers emerged from the other vehicles, all in dress uniform, all moving with the synchronized precision of men who had trained together, fought together, bled together. 12 soldiers in total. Each one a veteran of conflicts most people only read about in newspapers. Each one owing their life, their training, or their sanity to the old man standing beside a rusted Harley-Davidson. Officer Rhodes was still holding the handcuffs, but her hands had begun to shake. Monroe had gone pale, his eyes darting between the soldiers and his partner, trying to calculate how badly they'd miscalculated. Sergeant Major Rodriguez walked across the street with measured steps. His boots clicked against the asphalt like a countdown. When he reached Jack, he stopped exactly 3 feet away and snapped to attention. "Colonel Wallace," he said, his voice carrying across the silent street. "Sir." Jack nodded once. "Sergeant Major." Rodriguez's eyes shifted to Officer Rhodes, taking in the handcuffs, the defensive posture, the confusion written across her face. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Officers, I'm Sergeant Major Rodriguez, Fort Carson. This man is Colonel John Wallace, United States Army Special Operations Command. He is a Medal of Honor recipient, a 3-time Purple Heart recipient, and the man who trained most of the Special Operations personnel currently serving in active combat zones." He paused, letting the words settle like dust after an explosion. "He is also under the protection of the United States military, as are all personnel with his clearance level and service record." Rhodes found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. We were responding to a public safety concern." Rodriguez looked at her for a long moment. Not with anger, but with the kind of disappointment that cut deeper than rage. "Ma'am, what public safety concern could possibly be posed by an 82-year-old man sitting at a red light on a motorcycle he's been riding for 65 years without incident?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Monroe stepped forward, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. "Sir, we were just—" "You were just what?" Rodriguez's voice didn't rise, but it carried the kind of authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. "Harassing a decorated war hero? Attempting to arrest a man whose service record is classified at levels you don't have clearance to read." Behind Rodriguez, the other soldiers had formed a loose semicircle. Not threatening, but unmistakably present. Among them stood men who had learned urban warfare from Jack Wallace. Men who had survived firefights because of tactics he'd taught them. Men who owed their lives to lessons learned in a garage in Colorado from an old man who never asked for thanks. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen stepped forward. Colonel Wallace trained me in close-quarters combat before my deployment to Afghanistan. Saved my life and the lives of my squad. Another voice, he taught me advanced reconnaissance. 3 tours. Never lost a man. Another, psychological warfare and resistance training. Got me through 18 months as a POW. One by one, they spoke. Not speeches, just simple statements of fact. Each one a testament to the man standing beside a motorcycle that had seen better days. Jack Wallace listened in silence, his face impassive. But those who knew him, really knew him, could see the slight tightening around his eyes. Emotion he'd learned to bury surfacing despite his best efforts. Officer Rhodes lowered the handcuffs. Her hands were shaking now, not with authority, but with the realization of how close she'd come to making a mistake that would have followed her for the rest of her career. I didn't know, she whispered. Rodriguez's expression softened slightly. Ma'am, that's exactly the point. You didn't know. You saw an old man on an old bike and made assumptions. You saw rust instead of strength. Age instead of experience. Silence instead of wisdom. He gestured toward Jack. This man has bled for your right to wear that badge. He's trained the soldiers who keep you safe while you sleep. He's earned the right to ride that motorcycle down any street in America without being questioned, harassed, or treated like a problem to be solved. The crowd had grown larger now, but it was completely silent. Even the teenager with the phone had stopped recording, too caught up in the moment to remember he was supposed to be documenting it. Marcus Bell stepped out from behind the gas pump, his Gulf War veteran cap in his hands. Colonel, he said quietly, your coffee's ready whenever you are. Jack looked at him and smiled. The first real smile anyone had seen from him all morning. Thank you, Marcus. I'll be right there. The soldiers didn't leave immediately. They stood in formation, a silent honor guard, as Jack Wallace walked across the street to Marcus Bell's gas station. His boots made the same measured sound they always had, but now everyone could hear the rhythm of dignity in each step. The crowd parted without being asked. Not out of fear, but out of respect, the kind that comes when you realize you've been in the presence of something larger than yourself and almost missed it entirely. Marcus had already poured the coffee. Black, no sugar, in a ceramic mug that had seen better days but still held heat like a promise. He set it on the counter next to the register, his hands steadier now than they'd been in 20 minutes. On the house today, Colonel, Marcus said quietly. Jack shook his head. I pay my way, Marcus. Always have. He pulled out a $5 bill, more than the coffee cost. But exact change had never been the point. Marcus took it, made change, and watched as Jack dropped the coins into the tip jar beside the register. The coffee was bitter, like the taste of being invisible for 50 years. But today, for the first time in decades, someone had seen him not as a problem to solve, but as a person to understand. Through the window, Jack could see Officer Rhodes standing beside her cruiser, talking quietly with Sergeant Major Rodriguez. Her posture had changed. The rigid authority was gone, replaced by something that looked like humility. Monroe stood a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that unconsciously mimicked the soldiers around him. You know, Marcus said, wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen too many mornings like this one. I always wondered about you, the way you carry yourself, the way you fix things. Never seen a man your age handle a wrench like you do. Jack sipped his coffee, eyes still on the scene outside. Most people see what they expect to see. And what did they expect to see today? A problem. An old man who'd outlived his usefulness. Someone who needed to be managed, controlled, put away for his own good and everyone else's safety. Marcus nodded slowly. And what should they have seen? Jack was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades. A man who's earned the right to live his life without explanation. A man who's given enough to this country that he shouldn't have to prove his worth every time he wants to ride to town for coffee. Outside, Sergeant Major Rodriguez was explaining something to Officer Rhodes. Her face had gone from defensive to mortified to something approaching understanding. She kept glancing toward the gas station, toward the old man sipping coffee like it was any other Thursday morning. You going to press charges? Marcus asked. Jack almost smiled. For what? Being young and making assumptions? Hell, Marcus? If we arrested everyone who jumped to conclusions, we'd need a lot more jails. They were going to arrest you. They were scared. Scared of what they didn't understand. Scared of making the wrong call. Scared of looking weak. Jack set down his mug. Fear makes people do stupid things. I've seen it in combat, I've seen it in peace. The uniform doesn't matter. The age doesn't matter. Fear is fear. Through the window, they watched as Rodriguez handed something to Officer Rhodes. It looked like a business card, but Jack knew it was more than that. It was a lifeline, a way for her to learn from this moment instead of being destroyed by it. What happens now? Marcus asked. Jack finished his coffee. Set the mug down with the same precision he did everything else. Now I ride home. Fix my tractor. Maybe work on the fence. Same as always. And them? Marcus nodded toward the officers. They go back to their jobs. Hopefully a little wiser. Hopefully understanding that the badge doesn't make you right. It makes you responsible. Jack stood, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Marcus called out, "Colonel." Jack turned. "Thank you for your service, for today, for showing us all something we needed to see." Jack nodded once. "Thank you for the coffee, Marcus, and for making the call." He stepped outside into the morning sun. The soldiers were still there, still in formation. Still standing as a reminder that some things honor, respect, brotherhood don't fade with age. Sergeant Major Rodriguez approached as Jack walked toward his Harley. "Sir, we can escort you home if you'd like." Jack shook his head. "I've been riding alone for a long time, Sergeant Major, but I appreciate the offer. Sir, if you ever need anything, I know where to find you." Jack swung his leg over the Harley, settled into the seat that had molded itself to his frame over decades of roads traveled. "Take care of yourselves. And take care of each other." He kicked the engine to life. It roared like it had something to prove, like it was announcing to the world that some things, loyalty, endurance. The bond between a man and his machine couldn't be measured by appearances. Officer Rhodes approached, her steps hesitant. "Sir? Colonel Wallace?" Jack looked at her, his expression neutral. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "I was wrong." He studied her face for a moment, seeing past the uniform to the person underneath. Young, trying to do right, learning the hard way that good intentions weren't always enough. "Officer Rhodes," he said finally, "the measure of a person isn't whether they make mistakes. It's what they do after they realize they've made them." He put the bike in gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a street full of people who would never look at an old man on an old motorcycle the same way again. The ride home was different. Not the road, that was the same 10 miles of asphalt and gravel it had always been, winding through Colorado countryside that changed with the seasons but never lost its quiet dignity. Not the bike. The Harley still rumbled with the same deep-throated satisfaction. Still carried him with the reliability of an old friend who'd never let him down. What was different was the weight. For 50 years, Jack Wallace had carried the invisible burden of being unseen. Not just overlooked, but fundamentally misunderstood. He'd grown used to it the way a man grows used to an old injury, aware of it always, but no longer expecting it to heal. Today, for a few minutes on Main Street, that weight had lifted. The sun was higher now, warming his shoulders through the flannel jacket. The mountains stood sharp against the sky, their peaks still touched with snow that would linger until spring decided to chase it away. Everything looked the same, but felt different. Clearer somehow. Like the world had been slightly out of focus for decades and someone had finally adjusted the lens. He thought about Officer Rhodes. Young, determined. Trying to do right in a world that didn't always make right and wrong easy to distinguish. She'd made a mistake, but she'd owned it. That counted for something. That counted for a lot. He thought about Marcus Bell, standing behind his gas pump with a phone in his hand and the courage to make a call that mattered. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple decision to stand up when standing up is hard. He thought about Sergeant Major Rodriguez and the 11 soldiers who dropped everything to drive across Colorado because someone had disrespected their teacher. They didn't owe him that. Their debt, if there had ever been one, had been paid long ago in the successful completion of missions, in lives saved, in the quiet satisfaction of watching students become teachers themselves. But they'd come anyway, because some bonds don't break. Some loyalties don't fade. Some debts aren't about money or obligation, they're about recognition. About seeing someone for who they really are and refusing to let the world diminish them. The farmhouse came into view. White paint and weathered wood standing against the backdrop of mountains and sky. The American flag still hung from its crooked pole, still moved with the wind like a prayer made visible. The barn door was still open from his morning routine, tools still waiting where he'd left them. Home. The same as it had been for 40 years, but somehow more itself today. More solid. More real. Jack pulled the Harley into the garage, next to the broken tractor that still needed fixing. He shut off the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through the barn. Then he swung his leg over the bike, hung his helmet on the handlebars, and walked to the workbench where his tools waited. The tractor's hydraulic system wasn't going to fix itself. But as he reached for his wrench, Jack Wallace smiled. Really smiled? For the second time that day. Because he'd remembered something important. He wasn't just an old man with an old bike and a broken tractor. He was a teacher, a soldier, a keeper of stories. He was someone who'd bled for his country and trained others to do the same. He was a man who'd earned his place in the world and didn't need anyone's permission to occupy it. The wrench felt good in his hands. Solid. Purposeful. Like everything else in his life, it was a tool that worked best when used with skill, patience, and respect for what it was meant to do. Outside, the sun climbed higher into the Colorado sky. The mountains stood their eternal watch. The flag moved with the wind. And in a garage that smelled of oil and iron and old victories, Colonel John Jack Wallace went back to work, fixing the things that could be fixed, accepting the things that couldn't, and knowing the difference between the two. Because that's what you do when you've lived 82 years and learned that the most important battles aren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes they're fought with dignity. Sometimes they're fought with silence. Sometimes they're fought with the simple refusal to be anything less than who you are. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you win them all.